taxing on consumers. But this is actually one, if not officially labeled as one. Hardworking Americans and businesses are charged extra fees on their phone bills in order to fund these programs. There must be a limit on how much we are willing to take from them, no matter how meritorious the spending could be. So let me be clear. I will be extremely reluctant to increase the budget for the rural health care program in any final item without corresponding spending reductions elsewhere. I thank the chairman and the staff for working with me to include additional questions on the impact of funding increases on consumers. I'm also pleased that the order makes clear that any price reductions undertaken by service providers to help address the current shortfall will be completely voluntarily. I vote to approve.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. At the FCC, we are focusing a lot of our efforts on closing the digital divide. One area where that divide is particularly stark is healthcare. Americans living in rural communities are falling behind when it comes to the availability of high-quality care. It's difficult to impossible to find specialists in many rural communities, and even basic care is often out of reach as we see rural hospitals closing by the dozen across the country. The FCC's Rural Health Care Program can help make a difference. This program uses money that consumers pay into the Universal Service Fund to subsidize the costs of connectivity that consumers in rural communities need for telemedicine and other advanced healthcare services. But unfortunately, this program is not living up to its potential. Our rules and the incentives they create are not serving the best interests of rural healthcare providers, the communities that depend on them, or the consumers that pay into the Universal Service Fund. At a time when the program is more important than ever to a growing number of rural communities, it's been heading in the wrong direction. In what is known as the telecom portion of the program, we've been spending more money to serve fewer and fewer healthcare institutions. Over the last 3 years, for example, the number of participants in the program dropped by 36%, while requests for funding grew by more than 67%. This means that limited program dollars are starting to concentrate in a small number of healthcare providers that are receiving increasingly large subsidies. Indeed, in 2016, just 5% of the participating healthcare providers received more than half of the available support. In addition to concentrating USF support in fewer communities, the program's trend lines are unsustainable for another reason. It does not encourage or incentivize prudent spending. The 5% of providers that now receive the lion's share of support are getting discounts of over 99% on their services. And the effective program discount has risen from 72% in 2011 to 95% last year. It's no surprise then that demand exceeded the program's budget for the first time in 2016, and that we're expecting to see the same outcome in 2017. So I'm glad the Commission is launching this proceeding to review the program. It's important that our rules incentivize the wise and prudent spending of program funds while ensuring that more Americans, regardless of where they live, have access to advanced telehealth services. As part of this inquiry, I'm pleased that we're now seeking comment on whether to adopt speed or other service benchmarks to ensure that supported services can in fact be used to bring telehealth offerings to rural communities. With this and the range of other questions we tee up, I'm confident that we can craft rules that will promote efficient purchasing decisions. In the interim, I support our decision to provide some immediate relief to healthcare providers that could otherwise face unexpected costs if the program exceeds its budget cap again this year. By waiving our rules, we allow service providers to voluntarily reduce their rates, which can help ensure that rural communities continue to receive service. So thanks to the staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau for your work on this item. It has my support, and I look forward to reviewing the record as it develops.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I've seen the future through a pair of virtual reality goggles as alarms were blaring in my ears and supervising physicians were urging me to administer CPR in order to save a patient. Now, I'm not a doctor, nor do I play one on television, but I got to see the future of medical care at the Simulation Training and Education Lab in Northwest Washington, where video game developers work hand in hand with researchers and clinicians to develop training for the MedStar health system. It turns out virtual reality can improve training by leaps and bounds, reducing real-world errors and improving patient outcomes. This is especially true for practitioners in rural and remote areas who lack the resources for regular in-person consultation and training with colleagues. But virtual reality requires bandwidth, and lots of it. Yet today, the Commission program dedicated to ensuring that that bandwidth reaches rural healthcare providers is stretched thin and about to break. There's an honest reason for that. When this program got its start 2 decades ago, neither connectivity nor medicine looked a lot like what they look today. Virtual reality, prescription vending machines controlled by doctors at a distance, and electronic health records were really just the stuff of science fiction. But as I saw at the lab in Washington, today these things have become standard medical training and practice. That's why I am pleased to support today's rulemaking. It examines how to future-proof the Commission's rural health care program, and at the same time it seeks comment on how to responsibly manage the program budget, and to this end it asks some important questions about prioritization. It also seeks comment on improving incentives to promote more efficient decision-making among funding recipients. I'm looking forward to the record that develops, and I'm also looking forward to seeing how we can use this program to speed the way for the future of medical care. That would be good news for both patients and practitioners, and also good news for rural America. Thank you to the Bureau for your work.
Thank you, Commissioner. Often in the early mornings, starting in the late 1970s, a doctor in the small town of Parsons, Kansas would hit the road. He would drive long distances across southeast Kansas to make sure that patients in even smaller surrounding communities could see a physician who could help them. That was my dad. And even into adulthood, I remain amazed at the many, many road miles that he has logged in his career. But his upcoming retirement brings into sharp focus, for me, some difficult general trends. It's becoming harder to recruit doctors and to keep them in these rural communities. It's becoming harder to keep rural hospitals afloat. And so it's becoming harder for rural patients to get health care. Ironically, at a moment when vital signs for those patients and rural America generally are suggesting trouble. That's what makes the combination of the internet and rural medicine, call it telemedicine or telehealth if you like, so critical. With a broadband connection, healthcare providers in small-town America can deliver the same quality of healthcare as those in our nation's big cities. And the FCC can and does promote this potential. Our rural healthcare program helps healthcare providers afford the connectivity they need in order to better serve their patients. But it's facing some real problems. First, the program is oversubscribed. The yearly demand for funding now exceeds the annual spending cap. And second, there may be substantial waste, fraud, and abuse in the program. Recent enforcement activity has shown that it is all too easy for unscrupulous companies to manipulate the system for their own profit at the expense of the American taxpayer and the rural healthcare providers that truly need support. So in this notice, we tackled 2 key issues. What size should the program be going forward, and how can it function more effectively? Every dollar in this program needs to be stretched as far as possible to help those in need in places like southeast Kansas. Thank you to the staff who have worked on this item, specifically Dana Bradford, Regina Brown, Sumita Das, Mary Beth DeLuca, Trent Harkrader, Belford Lawson, Radhika Karmarkar, Dave Corey, Paul LaFontaine, Billy Layton, Jonathan Lecter, Travis Littman, Rick Mallon, Elizabeth McCarthy, Maura McGowan, Avis Mitchell, Chris Monteith, Linda Oliver, Ryan Palmer, Rakesh Patel, Carol Pomponia, Eric Ralph, Bill Richardson, Ariel Roth, David Sabatkin, Jeffrey Waldow, and last but certainly not least, our presenter, Preston Wise. With that, we'll move to a vote on the item. Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner Riley.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for the fantastic job. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. It is entitled Review of Collocations on Certain Towers Constructed Without Documentation of Section 106 Review, and Don Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Stockdale, whenever you are ready, the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I am pleased to present to you a public notice seeking comment on a plan to exclude from routine historic preservation review the co-location of wireless communications equipment on certain towers known as twilight towers. I'm joined at the table today by Suzanne Tétrault, Garnet Hanley, Jeff Steinberg, and Dan Margolis. In addition to the WTB staff at the table, I would like to thank Paul Dari, Eli Johnson, and Jill Springer from our Competition and Infrastructure Policy Division for their work, and all of the Commission staff listed on the slide for their input. Dan will now present the item.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners.
Good morning.
This public notice would continue the Commission's efforts to streamline wireless infrastructure deployment by seeking comment on a definitive solution for expediting equipment co-locations on so-called twilight towers. Twilight towers are towers that were constructed between March 16, 2001 and March 7, 2005 that either did not complete historic preservation review or that cannot be documented to have completed such review. During that time period, the Commission's historic preservation rules required licensees and applicants to evaluate whether proposed facilities may affect historic properties. But the text of the rule did not specify a particular process that parties were required to follow. The National Historic Preservation Act requires every federal agency, before allowing an undertaking within its jurisdiction to proceed, to consider the undertaking's effects on buildings and sites that are eligible for protection as historic properties. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, or the ACHP, has established rules governing the process for conducting historic preservation review. The Advisory Council also has the authority to adopt program alternatives that may be used by federal agencies to exclude from review particular types of federal undertakings that have minimal potential to adversely affect historic properties. Under one such program alternative, the Nationwide Programmatic Agreement, or NPA, for co-location of wireless antennas, most co-locations on towers that themselves underwent historic preservation review are excluded from any further review. But since twilight towers lack the documentation of any prior review, co-locations on twilight towers are not eligible for the co-location NPA's exclusion from historic preservation review. This public notice seeks public input on a type of program alternative, a draft program comment, that would facilitate co-locations on twilight towers by generally excluding from the historic preservation review process co-locations that meet certain specified conditions. If adopted by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, this draft program comment would make potentially thousands of existing twilight towers available for co-locations without the need for either the co-location or the underlying tower to complete historic preservation review. The draft program comment thus treats these twilight towers like older towers constructed before March 16, 2001, which are already excluded from the historic preservation review process. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Margolis. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. Our best estimates show today that there are just over 4,000 twilight towers across the United States. To those outside of the world of the communications bar, be happy. Sorry, those in the communications bar. But these are wireless towers for which the historic preservation review process may or may not have been completed. Now, I am sure that those who worked on the 2001 and 2005 nationwide programmatic agreements could not have imagined that mysterious and frustrating questions about the legality of these towers would be the subject of a 2017 proceeding. Nevertheless, as someone's phone goes off, yes, I did tell on you, the approach we are taking through today's public notice seeks to resolve what has become a confounding issue. Program comments present an alternative, streamlined procedure for a co-location applicant to comply with the historic review requirements. In 2013, as acting chair, I saw firsthand how effective program comments could be when I directed the staff of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau to prepare and release one to address towers to deploy positive train control communications. It is important that we design program comments to ensure that tribal nations have a full opportunity to participate in the review of a proposed co-location. In our April 2017 NPRM on facilitating wireless infrastructure deployment, we discussed how tribal nations have expressed concern that some of the Twilight Towers, which were constructed between 2001 and 2005, may have effects on properties of religious and cultural significance. So I am glad that this program comment makes clear that a tribal nation may request direct government-to-government consultation with the FCC at any time with respect to a Twilight Tower or co-location. I thank the Bureau for their work on this proceeding and will ask forgiveness to the Bureau Chief for letting everyone know that that was his phone that went off. Thank you.
Fortunately, no one's watching, right? Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. None of us currently on the Commission caused the Twilight Tower situation, which originated back in the early 2000s. Instead, we get the job of cleaning up the mess. Today, we take a decisive first step to do just that. Once complete, our resulting actions will expedite certain antenna co-locations, reduce the need for additional macro tower construction and placement, facilitate the expansion of wireless networks, including FirstNet, and improve the wireless experience for consumers. Having toiled on this issue for several years, I'm well aware of some differing perspectives and views on what best to do with Twilight Towers. Over that time, I've explored assorted options and participated in countless conversations over possible solutions, seeking resolution while demanding a realization of the realities. I've pushed Commission staff, many of whom are no longer here to see this conclusion, to expedite consultations and craft a draft order expeditiously. And I know there have been endless discussions, consultations, negotiations, workshops, and conferences with staff and stakeholders over the years that never resulted in a resolution of the problem. All of this preceding work, however, has led us to this public notice, and I want to thank the Chairman and Commissioner Carr for their leadership in making this issue one of the early action items for removing infrastructure barriers. This PN is an incredibly positive step forward to address the regulatory purgatory faced by those owning so-called Twilight Towers. These towers, some 4,300 or so by most estimates, as Commissioner Clyburn highlighted, have been in operation bringing wireless service to American people for somewhere between 12 and 16 years. At the same time, owners of these towers, many of which have been since sold, have been stuck, unable to accept co-locating partners while policymakers wrestle with the fact that the requisite historic preservation reviews were not documented. In fact, it is estimated these towers could accommodate an additional 6,500 antennas. Consumers have been prevented from the many benefits from fully loaded towers, including increased network coverage. Since I'm aware of no one that possesses a time machine in order to go back and conduct the reviews pursuant to Commission rules in place today and not back then, we must operate in the present with the facts as they are, not how we may like them to be. Basically, these towers already exist, and in most cases, tough one there, were never subject to, to a complaint. It would take millions of dollars and years to create a list of all the Twilight Towers and have them individually reviewed. And in the meantime, these towers would continue to be underutilized to the detriment of consumers. With this in mind, as well as the realization that the Commission will not undertake enforcement action against tower owners for the uncertainty caused by our own doing, the public notice takes the most appropriate action by establishing a draft program comment for consideration by the ACHP. Specifically, the contents of the draft program comment would exclude co-locations of wireless facilities on Twilight Towers from Section 106 review. In effect, we are moving forward and closing the sad chapter in regulatory history. I thank the Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Today, we take another significant step in our ongoing effort to accelerate and streamline the deployment of wireless infrastructure. Specifically, as we've heard, we propose to resolve what's been a long-standing issue with twilight towers. The approach we adopt today will culminate in the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation adopting a document known as a program comment that would exclude co-locations of communications equipment on twilight towers from routine historic preservation review. This action could open up thousands of towers for the deployment of new wireless facilities. As such, these towers would be treated similarly to older towers that are already excluded from historic preservation review. We also make clear that the agency will not take enforcement action against twilight towers that were constructed in good faith. This clarification further removes the regulatory uncertainty that has hung over these deployments for far too long. I'm grateful as well for the engagement that we've seen on this issue. In response to public input, we make clear in the draft program comment that where a proposed co-location on a twilight tower is not excluded from historic preservation review, such review will be limited to the co-location itself and not the underlying tower. We also clarify the standard under which the FCC will treat a request for direct government-to-government consultation, as we've heard, by a tribal nation, to be a complaint against a proposed co-location. These clarifications will provide stakeholders with additional certainty, and I thank my colleagues for their willingness to incorporate these changes into the draft program comment. For more than a decade, as we've heard, the FCC and a broad range of stakeholders have debated the best approach for resolving the regulatory status of twilight towers. So I'm glad that this commission is moving forward with a concrete solution that can open up these structures for additional wireless deployments. Doing so will help bring advanced wireless offerings to even more Americans. So I thank the staff of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau for their hard work on this item and for their broader efforts to streamline the deployment of wireless infrastructure. I look forward to continuing to make progress on these issues in the months to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
For too long, towers built during the twilight period have been caught in a regulatory quagmire. During this 4-year period from 2001 to 2005, both the Commission and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation were adjusting their rules to accommodate the need to facilitate the nationwide building of wireless infrastructure. But before any new policies were put in place, towers were put in the ground, and ever since, these facilities have been stuck in regulatory limbo. Today's proposal doesn't offer the time machine that Commissioner O'Reilly talked about, but it does try to bring an end to this ambiguity and make these towers available for co-location without sacrificing the ability to entertain meaningful objections or engage in tower-specific mitigation. This approach can benefit the First Responder Network Authority and other broadband providers seeking to swiftly deploy new infrastructure. It also can further historic preservation goals by limiting the need for additional towers. But I do think we still have a long way to go to honor our federal trust responsibility to tribal communities impacted by towers constructed during the twilight period. I concur today because I believe that our effort here is well-intended, but falls short of what is required. If we proceed with this draft proposal, I think we need to simultaneously update the Commission's statement of policy on establishing a government-to-government relationship between the agency and federally recognized tribes. This document has not been revisited since it was adopted more than a decade and a half ago. I think it's time to take on this task and do it in conjunction with resolving these long-standing issues of tower construction. In doing so, we can set a clear and updated course for Commission policy while also giving substance to tribal self-determination. And that, I believe, would be worth the effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Similar to the vampires in the Twilight series, for many of us at the Commission, Twilight Towers has seemed like an issue that simply would never die. But no more. Today, I am pleased that after more than a decade, the FCC is finally moving forward to address this longstanding problem. After many discussions with tribal representatives, industry, and other interested stakeholders, it is now clear that it is up to the FCC, working with our colleagues at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, or ACHP, to finally solve this problem. And none too soon. The more rapidly we enable the additional use of this infrastructure, the sooner consumers everywhere can benefit from next-generation wireless services. It is my hope that this issue will be wrapped up at long last by the middle of next year. I appreciate the engagement of ACHP staff on this issue and look forward to working with them as we advance this and other wireless infrastructure issues. I would also like to thank my colleagues for their support on this item. In particular, thanks to Commissioner O'Reilly, who has long called for a resolution to this issue, and to Commissioner Carr for his continued leadership on our wireless infrastructure reform docket. And last but most, thanks to the staff who worked on this item: Paul Dari, Garnet Hanley, Eli Johnson, Dan Margolis, Dana Schaefer, Jill Springer, Jeff Steinberg, Don Stockdale, Cecilia Sulhoff, Suzanne Tatro, and Mary Claire York from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Janet Seifert from the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, and Deborah Broderson, Linda Oliver, and Bill Richardson from the Office of General Counsel. Terrific work by all of you across these bureaus and offices. We'll now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner Clyburn.
Aye.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Concur.
Chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for the great work. Madam Secretary, could you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fourth item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau and is entitled Restoring Internet Freedom. Chris Monteith, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Terrific. Ms. Monteith, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
I think it's still morning, so good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good morning.
The Wireline Competition Bureau presents for your consideration a declaratory ruling, report and order on restoring Internet freedom. The item would eliminate burdensome regulation that stifles innovation and deters investment and empower Americans to choose the broadband Internet access service that best fits their needs. I would like to thank the Competition Policy Division team for their amazing work on this proceeding. We also received invaluable input from our colleagues in the wireless telecommunications, consumer and governmental affairs, enforcement, media, and public safety and homeland security bureaus, as well as from the offices of General Counsel and Strategic Planning. Seated at the table with me from the Wireline Competition Bureau are Madeline Finley, Deputy Bureau Chief, Eric Ralph, Chief Economist, Daniel Kahn, Division Chief, Competition Policy Division, Melissa Kirkle, Assistant Division Chief, CPD, and Deborah Salins, Attorney Advisor, CPD. Joining me at the table from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau are Don Stockdale, Bureau Chief, and Neshe Gundelsberger, Deputy Bureau Chief, and from the Office of Strategic Planning, Jerry Ellig, Chief Economist. Deborah will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
This declaratory ruling, report and order takes several actions to restore Internet freedom. First, the declaratory ruling restores broadband Internet access service to its Title I Information Service classification. The item finds that reclassification as an information service best comports with the text and structure of the Communications Act, Commission precedent, and the Commission's policy objectives. In doing so, the item ends heavy-handed, utility-style regulation of the Internet in favor of a light-touch framework which worked for decades prior to 2015. The declaratory ruling also reinstates the private mobile service classification of mobile broadband Internet access service and returns to the Commission's definition of interconnected service that existed prior to 2015. The item restores the authority of the Federal Trade Commission to enforce consumer protection and antitrust laws. It also clarifies the effects of the return to an information service classification on other regulatory frameworks, including the need to apply a uniform federal regulatory approach to interstate information services like broadband Internet access service. Next, the report and order adopts a transparency rule that would require internet service providers to disclose information about their practices to consumers, entrepreneurs and other small businesses, and the Commission. The item returns to the transparency rule the Commission adopted in 2010 with certain improvements to promote additional transparency. The report and order would also eliminate the Commission's conduct rules. Based on the record evidence, the item finds that the conduct rules are unnecessary because the transparency requirement, together with antitrust and consumer protection laws, ensures that internet service providers engaging in behavior inconsistent with an open internet can be held accountable. The actions taken in this item will advance the Commission's critical work to promote broadband deployment in rural America and infrastructure investment throughout the nation, brighten the future of innovation both within networks and at their edge, and move closer to the goal of eliminating the digital divide. The Bureau recommends adoption of this declaratory ruling, report and order, and requests editorial privileges extending only to technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lantz, for the presentation, and Ms. Monteith. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. Before beginning my statement, Mr. Chairman, I would like to note that Congressman Jerry McNerney, a member of the Congressional Committee that has oversight over this agency, requested the opportunity to speak today. He was denied, but I have a copy of a statement that the congressman would have delivered had he been given the opportunity. And, Mr. Chairman, respectfully, I would ask that you include this in official record of this proceeding, if you will allow.
Without objection.
Thank you. I dissent. I dissent from this fierily spun, legally lightweight, consumer-harming, corporate-enabling, destroying Internet freedom order. I dissent because I am among the millions outraged. Outraged because the FCC pulls its own teeth, abdicating responsibility to protect the nation's broadband consumers. Now, some may ask, why are we witnessing such unprecedented groundswell of public support for keeping the 2015 net neutrality protections in place? Because the public can plainly see that a soon-to-be toothless FCC is handing the keys to the Internet, one of the most remarkable, empowering, enabling inventions of our lifetime, over to a handful of multi-billion-dollar corporations. And if past is prologue, those very same broadband Internet service providers that the majority says you should trust to do right by you will put profits and shareholders' returns above what is best for you. Each of us raised our hands when we were sworn in as FCC commissioners. We took an oath and promised to uphold our duties and responsibilities to, a liberal quote here, make available so far as possible to all the people of the United States without discrimination a rapid, efficient, nationwide, and worldwide wire and radio communication service with adequate facilities at reasonable charges. Today, the FCC majority is about to officially abandon that pledge, and millions are watching and taking note. I do not believe that there are any FCC or congressional offices immune to the deluge of consumer outcry. We are even hearing about state and local offices fielding calls. And what is newsworthy that at last count, and I think the number is rising, 5 Republican members of Congress went on the record in calling for a halt to today's vote. Why such a bipartisan outcry? Because the large majority of Americans are in favor of keeping strong net neutrality rules in place. But the saddest part to me about all of this, and it's painful for me to say this, that this is the new norm at the FCC, a norm where the majority ignores the will of the people, a norm where the majority stands idly by while the people that they are committed to serve, that they've taken an oath to serve, are about to lose so much. Now, we have heard story after story about what net neutrality means to consumers and small businesses, from places as diverse as Los Angeles Skid Row to Marietta, Ohio. I have here letters that just were sent to me that plead with the FCC to keep our net neutrality rules in place. But what is striking and in keeping with the new norm is that despite the millions of comments, letters, and calls received, this order cites not even one. That speaks volumes about the direction the current majority is heading, this FCC is heading, and that speaks volumes about just who is being heard at the FCC. Those sole proprietors whose entire business models depend on an open internet are worried that the absence of clear and enforceable net neutrality protections will result in higher cost and fewer benefits because, you see, they are not able to pay those tolls for premium access. Large online businesses have also weighed in, expressing concerns about being subject to added charges as they simply try to reach their own customers. Engineers have submitted comments, including many of those internet pioneers. They shared with the FCC majority the fundamentals of how the internet works because from where they sit, there is no way that an item like this would ever see the light of day if the majority understood the platform that some of them helped to create. I have heard from innovators worried that we are standing up a mother may I regime where the broadband provider becomes the arbiter of acceptable online business models. And yes, I have heard from consumers who are worried, given that their broadband providers has already shown that they will charge inscrutable below-the-line fees, raise prices unexpectedly, and put consumers on hold for hours at a time, who will have their best interests at heart in a world without clear and enforceable rules, overseen by an agency without any clear authority. Would that agency be a toothless FCC? Now, there is a darker side to all of this that we have witnessed over the past few weeks. Threats and intimidation, personal attacks, Nazi cheering, Russian influence, fake comments. These are unacceptable. Some of these actions are illegal. They are all to be rejected. But what is also not acceptable is the FCC's refusal to cooperate with the state attorney general's investigations or allow evidence in the record that would undercut what can only be described as a preordained outcome. Now, many have been asking me, what happens next? How will all of this, net neutrality, my internet experience, look after today's decision? My answer is a simple one. When the current protections are abandoned and the rules that have been officially in place since 2015 are repealed, we will have a Cheshire Cat version of net neutrality. We will be in a world where regulatory substance fades to black, and all that is left is a broadband provider's toothy grin, because they have teeth, however you conjugate that. And those also comforting words, we have every incentive, don't worry, we have every incentive to do the right thing. But what they will soon have is every incentive to do their own thing. Now, the results of throwing out net neutrality protections may not be felt right away. Most of us will get up tomorrow morning, get ready for work, and over the next week, wade through what would be, no doubt, hundreds of headlines. We will grow tired of those hundreds of headlines. We will grow tired hearing from endless prognosticators, and we will quickly submerge ourselves into a sea of holiday bliss. But what we have wrought today will one day be apparent, and by then, when you really wake up and see what has changed, I fear it may be too late to do anything about it because there will be no agency empowered to address your concerns. This item insidiously ensures that the FCC will never be able to fully grasp the harm it may have unleashed on the Internet ecosystem. And that inability might lead decision makers to conclude that the next Internet startup that failed to flourish, that attempted to seek relief by whatever authority may or may not be in charge, with many teeth they might have left, simply that maybe they just had a bad business plan, when in fact the actual culprit was the absence of a level playing field online. Particularly damning is what today's repeal would mean for marginalized groups like communities of color that rely on platforms like the internet to communicate. You see, traditional outlets rarely, if ever, consider their issues or concerns worthy of coverage. It was through social media, remember, that the world first heard about Ferguson, Missouri, because those legacy outlets did not consider them worthy enough for coverage until that hashtag started trending. It has been through online video services that targeted entertainment ecosystems thrive, where stories are finally being told because those very same programs that were submitted for consideration were rejected time and time again by mainstream media and distribution, mainstream distribution and media outlets. And it has been through secure messaging platforms where activists have communicated and organized for justice without gatekeepers who may or may not have differing opinions blocking them. Where will the next significant attack on internet freedom come from? Maybe from a broadband provider allowing its network to congest, making a high-traffic video provider ask what more can it pay to make that pain go away? That will never happen, you say? Newsflash, it already has. The difference now is the open question of what is stopping them. The difference after today's vote is that no one will be able to stop them. Maybe several providers will quietly roll out paid prioritization packages that will enable deep pocket players to cut the queue. Maybe a vertically integrated broadband provider decides that it will favor its own apps and services, or some high-value Internet of Things traffic will be subject to an additional fee. Maybe some of these actions will be cloaked under non-disclosure agreements and wrapped up in mandatory arbitration clauses so that it will be a breach of contract to disclose these publicly or take the provider to court if there is any wrongdoing. Some may say, of course this will never happen, but after today's vote, what will be in place to stop any of this? What we do know is that broadband providers did not even wait for the ink to dry on a proposed order before making their moves. One broadband provider who had in the past promised to not engage in paid prioritization has now quietly dropped that promise from its list of commitments on its website. What's next? Blocking or throttling? That will never happen, you say? After today's vote, exactly who is the cop on the beat that can or will stop them? And just who will be impacted the most? Consumers and small businesses, that's who. The internet continues to evolve and has become even more critical for every participant in our 21st century ecosystems. Government services have migrated online, as have educational opportunities, job notices, and applications. But at the same time, broadband providers have continued to consolidate. They have become bigger. They own their own content. They own their own media companies. And they own or have interest in other types of competing services. So why are millions of Americans so alarmed? Because they understand the risk this all poses. And even those who might not exactly know what it means when somebody says Title II authority, what they know is that they will be at risk without it. Now, I've been asking myself repeatedly why the majority is so single-focused on overturning these wildly popular rules. Is it simply because they felt that the 2015 net neutrality order, which threw out over 700 rules, which dispensed with more than 25 provisions, was too heavy-handed? Or is this a ploy to create a need for legislation where there was none before? Or is it to establish uncertainty where little previously existed? Is it a tactic to undermine the net neutrality protections adopted in 2015 that are currently parked at the Supreme Court? You know, the very same rules that were resoundingly upheld by the D.C. Circuit last year? No doubt we will see a rush to the courthouse asking the Supreme Court to vacate and remand the substantive rules that we have fought so hard for over the past few years, because today the FCC uses legally suspect means to clear the decks of substantive protections for consumers and competition. It is abundantly clear why we see so much bad process with this item, because the fix was already in. There is no real mention of the thousands of net neutrality complaints filed by consumers. Why? The majority has refused to put them in the record, while maintaining the rhetoric that there have been no real complaints or no real violations. Record evidence of massive incentives and abilities of broadband providers to act in anti-competitive ways are missing from the docket. Why? Because those in charge have refused to use the data and knowledge the agency does have and has relied on in the past to inform our merger reviews. As the majority has shown time and time again, the views of individuals do not matter, including the views of those who care deeply about the substance, but may not be Washington insiders. There is a basic fallacy underlying the majority's actions and rhetoric today. The assumption of what is best for broadband providers is obviously what is best for America. Breathless claims about unshackling broadband services from unnecessary regulation are only about ensuring that broadband internet service providers have and maintain the keys to the internet. Assertions that this is merely a return to some imaginary status quo ante cannot hide the fact that this is the very first time that the Federal Communications Commission has disavowed substantive protections for consumers online. And when the current 2015 net neutrality rules are laid to waste, we may be left with no single authority with the power to protect consumers. Now, this order loudly crows about handing over authority of broadband to the Federal Trade Commission, but what is absent from the order and glossed over in a haphazardly issued afterthought of a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, is that the FTC is an agency with none, nada, technical expertise in telecommunications. The FTC is an agency that may or may not even have authority over broadband providers in the first instance. The FTC is an agency that, if you can even reach a very high bar of proving unfair or deceptive practices and that there is substantial consumer injury, it may take years upon years for any remedy to be levied, and most companies don't have years and years to wait for an answer. But don't just take my word for it. Even one of the FTC's own commissioners has articulated these very concerns. And if you are wondering why the FCC is preempting state consumer protection laws in this item without notice, let me help you with a simple jingle that you can easily commit to memory that will underscore all of this. If it benefits industry, preemption is good. If it benefits consumers, preemption is bad. Reclassification of broadband would do more than wreak havoc over net neutrality. It will also undermine our universal service construct for years to come, something which the order implicitly acknowledges. It will undermine the Lifeline program. It will weaken our ability to support robust broadband infrastructure deployment. And what we will soon find out is what a broadband market unencumbered by robust consumer protections will look like. I suspect that it will not be very pretty. I know that there are many questions on the minds of Americans right now, including what the repeal of net neutrality will mean for them. To help understand or to answer or address outstanding questions, I plan to host a town hall through Twitter next week on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But what saddens me the most today is that the agency that is supposed to protect you is actually abandoning you. But what I am pleased to be able to say today is that the fight to save net neutrality does not end today. The agency does not have the final word. Thank goodness for that. And as I close my eulogy of the 2015 net neutrality rules, carefully crafted rules that actually struck an appropriate balance in providing consumer protections and enabling opportunities and investment, I actually take what I'll just call ironic comfort in the words of then Commissioner Pai back in 2015, because I believe this will ring true about this destroying Internet freedom order. I am optimistic, he said, that we will look back on today's vote as an aberration, a temporary deviation from the bipartisan path that has served us so well. I don't know whether this plan will be vacated by a court, reversed by Congress, or overturned by a future commission, but I do believe that its days are numbered. Amen to that, Mr. Chairman. Amen to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. I'm going to mark you down as a no. So that's Commissioner O'Reilly.
To the main event. I'll have a longer statement if it's believable, since this is long enough itself. The order before us represents the culmination of extensive work by the agency staff to carefully consider whether net neutrality rules are truly warranted, thoroughly reviewing the legal underpinnings, economic analysis, and practical effects, as debated extensively and exhaustively in the record of this proceeding. I agree with the decision, and I support such a well-reasoned and soundly justified order. While I have longstanding views on this topic, I approached this proceeding with an open mind. I read the substantive comments with interest and met with anyone I could, no matter how of their or what their particular viewpoint. In the end, I'm simply not persuaded that heavy-handed rules are needed to protect against hypothetical harms. In all this time, I've yet to hear recent unquestionable evidence of demonstrable harms to consumers that demands providers be constrained by this completely flawed regulatory intervention. I still cannot endorse guilt by imagination. It is a shame that this topic has been plagued by baseless fear-mongering. Many small businesses have been blatantly misled into thinking that they're going to be forced to pay more to continue to do business online. Others have been told that free speech and civil rights are on the line. It simply isn't true, and we know that from experience. The Internet has functioned without net neutrality rules far longer than with them. Nobody can name more than a handful of examples that occurred over the course of an entire decade prior, and that were readily dealt with, whether actual violations or not. The legend of a cable company trying to break the Internet may make a scary bedtime story for children of telecom geeks, but it isn't reality. So, for those of you out there that are fearful of what tomorrow may bring, please take a deep breath. This decision will not break the Internet. What we are doing is reverting back to the highly successful, bipartisan, governmental approach that existed before 2015. As the order makes clear, We depart from the prior Commission's approach because we determined that the decision was flawed. We believe that our statutory interpretation and course of action is the better one, and our decision is grounded in and supported by the record. The text has been publicly available for over 3 weeks, and our good staff has summarized it for us today. So there is no need for me to step through the policies and reasoning again in detail. Instead, I'll highlight a few key parts and address some of the false arguments and misconceptions regarding the substance and process. While repealing net neutrality rules grabs headlines, reversing the classification of broadband internet access service as a Title II telecommunications service is far more consequential. Net neutrality started as a consumer issue, but it soon became a stepping stone to impose vastly more onerous common carrier regulations on broadband companies. Even the previous chairman initially attempted to reinstate net neutrality rules under more limited legal authority, and many companies would have accepted the compromise and lived with net neutrality rules as long as the Commission didn't impose Title II. But thanks to one infamous YouTube video posted by the prior administration, this so-called independent agency was quickly railroaded into treating ISPs like public utilities instead. As discussed at length in the order, and the dissents of Chairman Pai and myself wrote in response to 2015 order, there were fundamental legal problems and factual errors underlying that decision to treat fixed and mobile broadband services as telecommunications services. Additionally, that decision opened the door for much broader regulation of broadband providers, and as we saw, the Commission quickly walked through that door. Under this structure, companies continue to face uncertainty that business decisions, commercial negotiations, service offerings, and pricing decisions would be scrutinized by the Commission. I believe that these legitimate concerns were well-founded, and if there had not been a change in administration, the agency would have proceeded further down the path as demonstrated by its zero-rating witch hunt. The decision to reinstate the classification of both fixed and mobile broadband internet access service as an information service under Section 3 and reinstate the classification of mobile broadband as a private mobile service under Section 332 eliminates these concerns and restores a sensible bipartisan approach to broadband services. Under this framework, the FCC asserts jurisdiction over broadband internet access service as an interstate information service, but applies regulation only to the extent warranted to address specific concrete concerns. With the elimination of Title II, there's no remaining legal basis for the net neutrality bright line rules and general conduct standard, so we must repeal them. In many proceedings before this agency, I've questioned the need for rules that impose costs but do not solve real problems, so the removal is completely appropriate and necessary. That isn't necessarily the end of the story, however. Congress may enact legislation providing new rules and legal authority to support them. I firmly believe that that would be the better course and the only way to give finality to this issue. I would humbly suggest, however, that the general conduct standard remain forever in the ash heap. This policy gave the Commission's Enforcement Bureau unbounded power to make up the rules as it went along, a frightening prospect. Businesses could find themselves subject to investigation without any prior notice that the conduct could be considered a violation. One public interest group even called the catch-all a recipe for overreach and confusion. It was the height of regulatory capriciousness and should never be resurrected. Similarly, I am hopeful that if the Congress does go down this path, it will see merit in rejecting a ban on paid prioritization. Clearly, there are cases today, and many more that will develop in time, in which the option of a paid prioritization offering would be a necessity based on either technology or needs of consumer welfare. I, for one, see great value in the prioritization of telemedicine and autonomous car technology over cat videos. And speaking of autonomous cars, we must ensure that wireless providers can manage their systems. Wireless networks have capacity constraints based on the physics of the spectrum they use. Generally, wireless use is booming, and more Americans are using wireless networks to access the internet. But this is just the beginning. Consider that each autonomous car vehicle is predicted to generate an additional 4 terabytes of data a day, much of which will be carried by wireless networks. It is hard to imagine that some prioritization of traffic will not be necessary, further undermining attempts to ban such practices. Although the order eliminates the bright line rules and general conduct standard, it does leave a version of the transparency requirements in place. In fact, the requirements are more extensive than those first adopted in 2010. While I remain skeptical of the legal authority for them or their value given the FTC's authority and without a mechanism to get them removed. If a business fails to disclose relevant information or its practices differ from what is described, it will be subject to the investigation and enforcement as outlined in the recent FCC-FTC Memorandum of Understanding. But I sincerely doubt that legitimate businesses are willing to subject themselves to a PR nightmare for attempting to engage in blocking, throttling, or improper discrimination. It is simply not worth the reputational cost and potential loss of business. Will I have to accept the decision to rely on Section 257 as authority for the transparency requirements? I do not believe that Section 218 or the provisions of Title III cited in the circulated version of the order should be invoked here. I'm relieved that they've been removed from the item at my request. Lastly, but certainly not least, the order contains a clear declaration that broadband is an interstate information service, and a robust preemption analysis is included. The order makes plain that broadband will be subject to uniform national framework that promotes investment and innovation. This is eminently reasonable and completely consistent with the Constitution's Commerce Clause. Broadband service is not confined to state boundaries and should not be constrained by a patchwork of state and local regulations. And this is particularly germane to wireless services, where mobile devices and the transmissions they carry can easily cross state lines. This could have dramatic and drastic results where it possible for such communications to be prioritized in one state but not in another. A hodgepodge of state rules could severely curtail not only the next generation of wireless systems that we have been working so hard to promote, but also the technologies that may rely on these networks in the future. Accordingly, any laws or regulations that conflict with or undermine the federal broadband policies are preempted. Given my druthers, I would actually have gone further on preemption, but I can only carry the debate so far today. This is not a new or novel position. The 2015 order, also announced a firm intention to exercise our preemption authority to preclude states from imposing obligations on broadband service that are inconsistent with the carefully tailored regulatory scheme. Well, the rules we adopt today are obviously different than the 2015 order. The concept that we will preempt inconsistent state and local requirements is well established. Although the order does acknowledge an extremely limited state role in enforcing their traditional police powers, state actions that go beyond this realm will be subject to scrutiny and challenge. The order makes clear that any requirements akin to common carrier regulation are barred. At my request, the order also specifies that states may not adopt their own transparency requirements, whether labeled as such or under the guise of consumer protection. I would also view state broadband privacy actions as outside the scope of what is permissible. The purpose of this order is to restore a light touch approach through deregulation. Therefore, any action to increase regulatory burdens on broadband providers would run directly counter to our efforts. I hope that most states and localities would not waste time and resources attempting to push the boundaries, but I realize that some will do so regardless. I expect the agency to be vigilant in identifying and pursuing these cases. I also commit to work closely with the chairman and the general counsel to quash any conflicts that arise. Before concluding, I want to address the atmospherics surrounding the process in this proceeding. I'll start with the number and identity of the comments submitted. Some would like us have us believe that the comment process has been irreparably tainted by the large number of fake comments. That view reflects a lack of understanding about the Administrative Procedure Act. The agency is required to consider and respond to all significant comments in the record. Millions of comments that simply say something along the lines of keep net neutrality or other colorful language we can't say in public, including a couple who referred to me as a potato. Whether
Wait, stop. Really?
Yeah. Say that I look like a potato. Okay.
Oh, no comment.
I meant it in a good way. Sorry.
Whether or not they are submitted by real people, bots, or honey badgers have no impact on the decision. As the order makes clear, we do not rely on any such comments. To be clear, that does not mean that comments were ignored. I commend staff for the extra effort that they had to sift through these extraneous comments. Many were simply obscenity-laced tirades. Yet the order reflects a careful evaluation and response to all the significant comments, including those that took a different position. Additionally, I disagree with the suggestion the Commission should have held public hearings. Any member of the public that wanted to express a view could have done so through the standard comment process, and many, many, many did. Public hearings may bring about some additional people in a particular location, but is inefficient for the reaching large numbers of interested parties from around the country. Finally, I see no merit in the suggestion that the agency should have delayed this vote until after the Ninth Circuit issues a decision in the en banc of the FTC versus AT&T Mobility case. While the panel decision raised some questions about the FTC's jurisdiction, it was widely viewed with skepticism. Moreover, the court's order granting en banc rehearing of the panel decision rendered it a legal nullity. Therefore, the FTC is not precluded from enforcing ISP's net neutrality commitments. In short, there is no basis for delay. I commend the chairman, his team, our hardworking and diligent staff for their enormous effort to produce an order of this quality and significance. I am sure that this task required long days and much time spent away from family and friends, and I hope that you'll be able to rest and reconnect over the holiday season. It is very deserved, and you'll have my full respect and profound appreciation for your work. I will vote to approve. I thank the chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. This is a great day for consumers, for innovation, and for freedom. We're reversing the Obama-era FCC's unprecedented decision to apply Title II regulations to the Internet. I'm proud to help end this 2-year experiment with heavy-handed regulation, this massive regulatory overreach. Prior to the FCC's 2015 decision, consumers and innovators alike benefited from a free and open Internet. This was not because the government imposed utility-style regulation. It didn't. This was not because the FCC had a rule regulating Internet conduct. It had none. Instead, through Republican and Democratic administrations alike, including through the first 6 years of the Obama administration, the FCC abided by a 20-year bipartisan consensus that the government should not control or heavily regulate Internet access. The Internet flourished under this framework. The private sector invested over $1.5 trillion in broadband networks. Consumers were protected and enjoyed the freedom to access the websites and content of their choosing. Every part of the Internet economy benefited, from innovators on the edge to startups and businesses of every size. Title II did not build that. Title II did not create the open Internet. And Title II is not the way to maintain it. The FCC's light regulatory touch, coupled with the robust consumer protections we restore today, supported our country's extraordinary Internet success story. After a 2-year detour, one that has seen investment decline, broadband deployments put on hold, and innovative new offerings shelved, it's great to see the FCC returning to this proven regulatory approach. Now, there's no doubt that the debate over Internet regulation has generated significant public attention, as it should. I, for one, have learned some colorful new turns of phrases through the course of this proceeding. And much of this is no surprise. Americans cherish the free and open Internet. But when it comes to this proceeding, far too many are simply fanning the false flames of fear. The apocalyptic rhetoric is quite something, even by Washington standards. No, the FCC is not ending the Internet, or as President Obama's first Federal Trade Commission chairman recently put it, the sky isn't falling, consumers will remain protected, and the Internet will flourish. What we're doing with today's vote is reversing a 2-year-old decision and returning to a tried and true regulatory framework, one that we know from our own experience works for consumers and for innovation. Many of the myths that are out there go to what I call the great Title II head fake, which is attributing to Title II things that it simply does not do. Some claim, for instance, that Title II is preventing ISPs from selling bundled or curated plans that offer access to only a portion of the internet. It's not true. The FCC expressly stated that Title II, right now, allows providers to do just that. Some claim that Title II is preventing ISPs from increasing their prices for broadband, so they're going to see a spike immediately after this decision. But the FCC emphasized that its Title II decision involves, quote, no rate regulation. And some claim that Title II is preventing ISPs from blocking, throttling, or engaging in paid prioritization. This is also not true. The D.C. Circuit said that Title II allows ISPs to, quote, block websites, to, quote, throttle applications chosen by ISPs, and, quote, to filter content into fast lanes and slow lanes based on ISPs' commercial interests, provided that they disclose those practices. In other words, Title II is not the thin line between where we are right now and some Mad Max version of the internet. There are reasons that consumers enjoyed a free and open internet long before Title II. There are reasons why consumers are free to access any website or online content of their choosing, and those reasons will continue to hold true long after our Title II experiment ends today. What are they? Well, the D.C. Circuit has offered its view. When it observed that Title II allows ISPs to offer filtered internet access, it also said that none were doing so because of what it said as fear of subscriber losses. In other words, market forces, not the Title II rules, are regulating this conduct. Now, there are some that will never accept market forces as a solution, either in the broadband marketplace or otherwise. But for them, today's order has some more good news. We're not relying on market forces alone. We're not giving ISPs free rein to dictate your online experience. Our decision today includes powerful legal checks. First, Americans will enjoy robust online protections. When the FCC classified broadband as a Title II Title II service in 2015, it divested the Federal Trade Commission of 100% of its consumer protection authority over ISPs, including its ability to police ISPs that engage in unfair or deceptive practices. Repealing Title II will restore important protections for internet openness. Second, consumers will regain strong online privacy protections. Before the FCC stripped it of jurisdiction, the FTC, the nation's most experienced privacy enforcement agency, brought over 500 privacy enforcement actions, including against ISPs. By reversing Title II, consumers get those privacy protections back. Third, federal antitrust law will protect against discriminatory conduct by ISPs. As a former Obama administration FTC chairman recently said, this is a formidable hammer against anyone who would harmfully block, throttle, or prioritize traffic. Fourth, state consumer protection laws will apply and state attorney generals can bring actions against ISPs. These authorities will provide another strong set of legal protections against unfair business practices by ISPs. In short, this is no free-for-all. This is no Thunderdome. The FCC is not killing the internet. While I spent most of my time today talking about the policy debate surrounding Title II, there's also a threshold legal question that the Commission must answer. Does Internet Access Service qualify as a Title I information service or Title II telecommunications service? Thankfully, I don't need to go beyond what the order itself says on this point. After all, in 2005, the Supreme Court expressly found that the FCC has authority to classify Internet Access Service as a Title I service. This remains the only classification blessed by the Supreme Court. So our decision today rests on sound legal footing. In closing, I want to look back 2 years ago to 2015 one more time. In October of that year, long before I became a commissioner, I gave a speech where I talked about the FCC's then recent Title II decision. I ended that speech by saying this: I'm optimistic the U.S. will return to the successful light touch approach to the internet that spurred massive investments in our broadband infrastructure. Efforts are underway in both the courts and Congress to reverse the FCC's decision. And following next year's presidential election, the composition of the FCC could be substantially different than it is today. Now, 2 years ago, I certainly did not imagine that I would be part of the FCC's new composition. But I'm very grateful for this opportunity to serve, and I'm grateful that my optimism back then has proven to be well-founded. I'm glad to cast my vote today in favor of internet freedom. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Okay. Net neutrality is internet freedom. I support that freedom. I dissent from this rash decision to roll back net neutrality rules. I dissent from the corrupt process that has brought us to this point, and I dissent from the contempt this agency has shown our citizens in pursuing this path today. This decision puts the Federal Communications Commission on the wrong side of history, the wrong side of the law, and the wrong side of the American public. The future of the internet is the future of everything. That is because there is nothing in our commercial, social, or civic lives that has been untouched by its influence or unmoved by its power. And here in the United States, our internet economy is the envy of the world. This is because it rests on a foundation of openness. That openness is revolutionary. It means you can go where you want and do what you want online without your broadband provider getting in the way or making choices for you. It means every one of us can create without permission, build community beyond geography, organize without physical constraints, consume content we want, when and where we want it, and share ideas not just around the corner, but across the globe. I believe it is essential that we sustain this foundation of openness, and that is why I support net neutrality. Net neutrality has deep origins in communications law and history. In the era when communications meant telephony, every call went through, and your phone company could not cut off your call or edit the content of your conversations. This guiding principle of non-discrimination meant you were in control of the connections you make. This principle continued as time advanced, technology changed, and internet access became the dial tone of the digital age. So it was 12 years ago when President George W. Bush was in the White House that this agency first put its net neutrality policies on paper. In the decade that followed, the FCC revamped and revised its net neutrality rules, seeking to keep them current and find them a stable home in the law. In its 2015 order, the FCC succeeded because in the following year, in a 184-page opinion, the agency's net neutrality rules were fully and completely upheld in court. So our existing net neutrality policies have passed court muster. They are wildly popular. But today we wipe away this work, destroy this progress, and burn down time-tested values that have made our internet economy the envy of the world. As a result of today's misguided action, our broadband providers will get extraordinary new powers. They will have the power to block websites, the power to throttle services, and the power to censor online content. They will have the right to discriminate and favor the internet traffic of those companies with whom they have a pay-for-play arrangement, and the right to consign all others to a slow and bumpy road. Now, our broadband providers will tell you they will never do these things. They say, just trust us. But know this, they have the technical ability and business incentive to discriminate and manipulate your internet traffic. And now this agency gives them the legal green light to go ahead and do so. This is not good. Not good for consumers, not good for businesses, not good for anyone who connects and creates online. Not good for the democratizing force that depends on openness to thrive. Moreover, it is not good for American leadership on the global stage of our new and complex digital world. I'm not alone with these concerns. Everyone from the creator of the World Wide Web to religious leaders, to governors and mayors of big cities and small towns, to musicians, to actors, to actresses, to entrepreneurs and academics and activists have registered their upset and anger. They are reeling at how this agency could make this kind of mistake. They are wondering how it could be so tone-deaf. And they are justifiably concerned that just a few unelected officials could make such a vast and far-reaching decision about the future of the Internet. So after erasing our net neutrality rules, what is left? What recourse do consumers have? We're told, don't worry, competition will save us. But the FCC's own data show that our broadband markets are not competitive. Half the households in this country have no choice of broadband provider. So if your broadband provider is blocking websites, you have no recourse. You have nowhere to go. We're told, don't worry, the Federal Trade Commission will save us. But the FTC is not the expert agency for communications. It has authority over unfair and deceptive practices. But to evade FTC review, all any broadband provider will need to do is add new provisions to the fine print in its terms of service. In addition, it is both costly and impractical to report difficulties to the FTC. By the time the FTC gets around to addressing them in court proceedings or enforcement actions, it's fair to assume that the startups and small businesses wrestling with discriminatory treatment could be long gone. Moreover, what little authority the FTC has is now under question in the courts. We're told, don't worry, state authorities will save us. But at the same time, the FCC all but clears the field with sweeping preemption of anything that resembles state or local consumer protection. If the substance that got us to this point is bad, the process is even worse. Let's talk about the public record. The public has been making noise, speaking up, raising a ruckus. We see it in the protests across this country, those that are outside here today, and we see it how they have lit up our phone lines, clogged our email inboxes, and jammed our online comment system. Now that might be messy, but whatever our disagreements are on this dais, I hope we can agree that that is democracy in action and something we can all support. To date, nearly 24 million comments have been filed in this proceeding. There is no record in the history of this agency that has attracted so many filings. But there's something foul in this record. 2 million comments feature stolen identities. 500,000 comments are from Russian email addresses. 50,000 consumer complaints are inexplicably missing from the record. I think that's a problem. I think our record has been corrupted and our process for public participation lacks integrity. 19 state attorneys general agree. They have written us demanding we halt our vote until we investigate and get to the bottom of this mess. Identity theft is a crime under state and federal law. And while it is taking place, this agency has turned a blind eye to its victims and callously told our fellow law enforcement officials, it will not help. This is not acceptable. It's a stain on the FCC and this proceeding. This issue is not going away. It needs to be addressed. Finally, I worry that this decision and the process that brought us to this point is ugly. It's ugly in the cavalier disregard this agency has demonstrated to the public, the contempt it has shown for citizens who speak up, and the sheer disdain it has for public opinion. Unlike its predecessors, this FCC has not held a single public hearing on net neutrality. There is no shortage of people who believe Washington is not listening to their concerns, their fears, and their desires. Add this agency to that list. Now, I too am frustrated, but here's a twist. I hear you. I listen to what the callers to my office are saying. I read the countless individually written emails in my inbox, the posts online, and the very short and sometimes very long letters. And I'm not going to give up. And neither should you. If the arc of history is long, we are going to bend this toward a more just outcome in the courts, in Congress, wherever we need to go to ensure that net neutrality stays the law of the land. Because if you are conservative or progressive, you benefit from internet openness. If you come from a small town or a big city, you benefit from internet openness. If you are a company or a nonprofit, you benefit from internet openness. If you are a startup or an established business, you benefit from internet openness. If you are a consumer or a creator, you benefit from internet openness. And if you believe in democracy, you benefit from internet openness. So let's persist, let's fight, let's not stop here or now. It's too important. The future depends on it.
Thank you, Commissioner. The internet is the greatest free market innovation in history. It's changed the way we live, the way we play, the way we work, the way we learn, the way we speak. During my time at the FCC, I've met with entrepreneurs in South Dakota who have started businesses. I've met with doctors in Ohio who have helped care for patients. I've met with teachers in Alaska who have educated their students. I've met with farmers in Missouri who have increased their crop yields. And I've met with many more who have succeeded, all because of the internet. And the internet has enriched my own life immeasurably. In the past few days alone, I have set up a FaceTime call with my parents and kids. I've downloaded interesting podcasts about blockchain technology. I've ordered a burrito. I've managed my playoff-bound fantasy football team. And, as many of you might have seen, I've tweeted. What is responsible for the phenomenal development of the internet? Well, it certainly wasn't heavy-handed government regulation. Quite to the contrary. At the dawn of the commercial internet, President Clinton and a Republican Congress agreed that it would be the policy of the United States to, and I quote, preserve the vibrant and competitive free market that presently exists for the internet, unfettered by federal and state regulation. This bipartisan policy worked. Encouraged by light touch regulation, America's private sector invested over $1.5 trillion to build out fixed and mobile networks throughout the United States. 28K modems gave way to gigabit fiber. Innovators and entrepreneurs grew startups into global giants. And America's internet economy became the envy of the entire world. And this light touch approach was good for consumers, too. In a free market full of permissionless innovation, online services blossomed. Within a generation, we have gone from email as the killer app to high-definition video streaming. Entrepreneurs and innovators guided the internet far better than the clumsy hand of government ever could have. But then, in early 2015, the FCC, under political pressure, jettisoned the successful bipartisan approach to the internet. On express orders from the previous White House, the FCC scrapped the tried and true light touch regulation of the internet and replaced it with heavy-handed micromanagement. It decided to subject the internet to utility-style regulation, designed in the 1930s to govern Ma Bell. This decision was a mistake. For one thing, there was no problem to solve. The internet wasn't broken in 2015. We were not living in some digital dystopia. To the contrary, the internet is one thing, perhaps the only thing in American society that we can all agree has been a stunning success. Not only was there no problem, this solution hasn't worked. The main complaint consumers have about the internet is not and has never been that their internet service provider is blocking access to content. It's that they don't have access at all or not enough competition. These regulations have ironically taken us in the opposite direction from these consumer preferences. Under Title II, investment in high-speed networks has declined by billions of dollars. Notably, this is the first time that such investment has declined outside of a recession in the Internet era. When there is less investment, that means fewer next-generation networks are built. That means less access and less competition. That means fewer jobs for Americans building those networks. And that means more Americans are stranded on the wrong side of the digital divide. And the impact has been particularly serious for smaller internet service providers. They don't have the time, the money, or the lawyers to navigate a thicket of complex rules. Now, they don't get a lot of press, certainly not here in Washington. But I've personally visited some of them, from Spencer Municipal Utilities in Spencer, Iowa, to Wave Wireless in Parsons, Kansas. I have personally spoken with many more, from Amplex Internet in Ohio to Airlink Services in Oklahoma. And so it is no surprise that the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, which represents very small fixed wireless companies that typically operate in rural and low-income urban areas, surveyed its members and found that over 80%, quote, incurred additional expense in complying with the Title II rules, had delayed or reduced network expansion, had delayed or reduced services, and had allocated budget to comply with the rules. Other small companies, too, have told the FCC that these regulations have forced them to cancel, delay, or curtail fiber network upgrades. And nearly 24 small providers submitted a letter saying that the FCC's heavy-handed rules affect our ability to find financing. Now remember, these are not the big guys. These are the small companies, the kinds of companies that are critical to providing a more competitive marketplace. Now, these rules have also impeded innovation. One major company, for instance, reported that it put on hold a project to build out its out-of-home Wi-Fi network due to uncertainty about the FCC's regulatory stance. And a coalition of 19 municipal internet service providers, that is, city government-owned nonprofits, have told the FCC that they, and I quote, often delay or hold off from rolling out a new feature or service because they cannot afford to deal with a potential complaint and enforcement action. None of this is good for consumers. We need to empower all Americans with digital opportunity, not deny them the benefits of greater access and competition. And consider, too, that these are just the effects that these rules have had on the Internet of today. Think about how they will affect the Internet that we need 10, 20 years from now. The digital world bears no resemblance to a water pipe or an electric line or a sewer. The use of those pipes will be roughly constant over time. And very few would say that there's been dramatic innovation in these areas. By contrast, online traffic is exploding, and we consume exponentially more traffic and data over time. With the dawn of the Internet of Things, with the development of high bitrate applications like virtual reality, with new activities that we can't fully grasp yet, like high-volume Bitcoin mining, we are imposing ever more demands on the network. And over time, that means our networks themselves will need to scale too. On advice of security, we need to take a brief recess.
Everyone, I need everyone to leave everything that you have in place. Do not take anything out of here except for your body. Do not take any bags, any books, or anything.
Sorry for the interruption. We were acting on the recommendation of the Federal Protective Service, but we can now reconvene. Where was I? Consider, too, that these are just the effects that our rules have had on the Internet of today. Now, think about how they'll affect the Internet that we need 10, 20 years from now. The digital world bears no resemblance to a water pipe or electric line or sewer. The use of those pipes will be roughly constant over time, and very few would say that there's dramatic innovation in those areas. By contrast, online traffic is exploding, and with the dawn of the Internet of Things, with the development of high bitrate applications like virtual reality, with new activities we can't fully grasp yet, like high-volume Bitcoin mining, we are imposing ever more demands on the network. Over time, that means that our networks themselves will have to scale too. But they don't have to. If our rules deter the massive infrastructure investment that we need, eventually we'll pay the price in terms of less innovation. Consider these words from Ben Thompson, a highly respected technology analyst, from a post on his blog Stratechery supporting my proposal. It's an extended quote, but with your indulgence, it's important. The question that must be grappled with is whether or not the Internet is done. By that I mean that today's bandwidth is all we will ever need, which means we can risk chilling investment through prophylactic regulation and the elimination of price signals that may spur infrastructure build-out. If we are done, then the potential harm of a Title II reclassification is much lower. Sure, ISPs will have to do more paperwork, but honestly, they're just a bunch of mean monopolists anyways, right? Best to get laws in place to preserve what we have. But what if we aren't done? What if virtual reality with dual 8K displays actually becomes something meaningful? What if those imagined remote medicine applications are actually developed? What if the Internet of Things moves beyond this messy experimentation phase and into real-time value generation, not just in the home, but in all kinds of unimagined commercial applications? I certainly hope we will have the bandwidth to support all of that. I do too. And as Thompson put it in another Stratechery post, and again I quote, "The fact of the matter is there is no evidence that harm exists in the sort of systematic way that justifies heavily regulating ISPs. The evidence does suggest that current regulatory structures handle bad actors perfectly well. The only future to fear is the one we never discover, because we gave up on the approach that already has brought us so far." Now remember, folks, networks don't have to be built. Risks don't have to be taken. Capital doesn't have to be raised. The costs of Title II today may appear, at least to some, to be hidden, but the consumers and innovators of tomorrow will pay a severe price. So, what is the FCC doing today? Well, quite simply, we are restoring the light touch framework that has governed the Internet for most of its existence. We are moving from Title II to Title I. Wonkier it cannot be. It is difficult to match that mundane reality to the apocalyptic rhetoric that we have heard from Title II supporters. And as the debate has gone on, their claims have gotten more and more outlandish. So let's be clear. Returning to the legal framework that governed the Internet from President Clinton's pronouncement in 1996 until 2015 is not going to destroy the Internet. It is not going to end the Internet as we know it. It is not going to kill democracy. It is not going to stifle free expression online. If stating these propositions alone doesn't demonstrate their absurdity, our Internet experience before 2015 and our Internet experience tomorrow, once this order passes, will prove them so. Simply put, by returning to the light touch Title I framework, we are helping consumers and promoting competition. Broadband providers will have stronger incentives to build networks, especially in unserved areas, and to upgrade networks to gigabit speeds and 5G. This means there will be more competition among broadband providers. It also means more ways that startups and tech giants alike can deliver applications and content to more users. In short, it is a freer and more open Internet. And we also promote much more robust transparency among ISPs than existed 3 years ago. We require ISPs to disclose a variety of business practices, and the failure to do so subjects them to enforcement action. This transparency rule will ensure that consumers know what they're buying and startups get the information they need as they develop new products and services. Moreover, we empower the Federal Trade Commission to ensure that consumers and competition are protected. 2 years ago, the Title II order stripped the FTC of jurisdiction over broadband providers. But today, we are putting the nation's premier consumer protection cop back on the beat. The FCC will once again have the authority to take action against internet service providers that engage in anti-competitive, unfair, or deceptive acts. As FTC Chairman Maureen Olhausen recently said, and I quote, "The FTC's ability to protect consumers and promote competition in the broadband industry isn't something new and far-fetched. We have a long-established role in preserving the values that consumers care about online." Or, as President Obama's first FTC chairman put it just yesterday, "The plan to restore FTC jurisdiction is good for consumers. The sky isn't falling, consumers will remain protected, and the internet will continue to thrive." So let's be clear. Following today's vote, Americans will still be able to access the websites they want to visit. They will still be able to enjoy the services they want to enjoy. There will still be cops on the beat guarding a free and open internet. This is the way things were prior to 2015, and this is the way they will be once again. Now, our decision today will also return regulatory parity to the internet economy. Now, some Silicon Valley platforms, giants, favor imposing heavy-handed regulations on other parts of the internet ecosystem. But all too often, they don't practice what they preach. Edge providers regularly block content that they don't like. When you go online, do you decide what news, search results, and products you see? Perhaps not. They regularly decide what you see and, perhaps more importantly, what you don't. And many thrive on the business model of charging to place content in front of eyeballs. What else is accelerated mobile pages or promoted tweets but prioritization? What is worse, there is no transparency into how decisions that appear inconsistent with an open internet are made. How does a company decide to restrict someone's accounts or block their tweets because it thinks their views are inflammatory or wrong? How does a company decide to demonetize videos from political advocates without any notice? How does a company expressly block access to websites on rival devices or prevent dissidents' content from appearing on its platform? How does a company decide to block from its app store a cigar aficionado app, apparently because the company believes that the app promotes tobacco use? You don't have any insight into any of these decisions, and neither do I. Yet these are very real, actual threats to an open internet. Ironic, coming from the very entities that claim to support it. Ironic, too, that so-called net neutrality advocates, most vigorously opposed to our reforms, have little to nothing to say about these threats. These are omissions, these are threats that a growing number of officials, Democrat and Republican, House and Senate, are beginning to take notice of. Now look, perhaps certain companies support saddling broadband providers with heavy-handed regulations because those rules work to their economic advantage. I don't blame them for taking that position. And I'm not saying that these same rules should be slapped on them too. What I am saying is that it is not the job of the government to be in the business of picking winners and losers in the internet economy. We should have a level playing field and let consumers decide who prevails. Now, many words have been spoken during this debate, but the time has come for action. It is time for the internet once again to be driven by engineers and entrepreneurs and consumers, rather than lawyers and accountants and bureaucrats. It is time for us to act to bring faster, better, and cheaper internet access to all Americans. It is time for us to return to the bipartisan regulatory framework under which the internet flourished prior to 2015. It is time for us to restore internet freedom. I want to extend my deepest gratitude to the staff who have worked so many long hours on this item. From the Wireline Competition Bureau, Anik Banoun, Joe Calishone, Megan Capasso, Paul Exech, Ben Childers, Nathan Egan, Madeline Finley, Doug Galby, Dan Kahn, Melissa Kirkle, Gail Krutov, Susan Lee, Ken Lynch, Pam Megna, Chris Monteith, Ramesh Nagarajan, Eric Ralph, Deborah Salons, Shane Taylor. From the Office of General Counsel, Ashley Boisel, Jim Carr, Christine Fargetstein, Tom Johnson, Doug Klein, Marcus Mayer, Scott Novak, Linda Oliver, and Bill Richardson. From the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Stacy Ferraro, Neshe Gundelsberger, Garnet Hanley, Betsy McIntyre, Jennifer Salas, Paroma Sanyal, Jimmy Shang, Don Stockdale, and Peter Trachtenberg. From the Office of Strategic Planning and Policy Analysis, Eric Berger, Mark Bykowski, and Jerry Ellig. From the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, Jerusha Burnett. From the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Ken Carlberg. And from the Media Bureau, Tracy Walden. With that, we will call the vote. Commissioner Clyburn.
I dissent.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
I dissent.
The chair votes aye. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for your terrific work on this item. Madam Secretary, could you please announce the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fifth item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and is entitled Amendment to Harmonize and Streamline Part 20 of the Commission's Rules Concerning Requirements for Licensees to Overcome a CMRS Presumption. Don Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Stockdale, once you and your folks are arranged, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, may I interrupt a little? I just want to know if his telephone's off.
Commissioner, I did turn it off. Thank you for reminding me.
Vibrate would have been fine. That's all right.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, I am pleased to present to you the CMRS Presumption Report and Order. I am joined at the table today by Suzanne Tétrault, Roger Noel, Kathy Harris, Tom Reed, and Jessica Griffenius. In addition to the staff at the table, I would like to thank the Commission staff listed on the slide for their input. Tom Reed will now present the item.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Good afternoon.
We present to you today a report and order that updates and harmonizes our regulations regarding the classification of commercial mobile radio services and private mobile radio services, primarily by eliminating sections 20.7 and 20.9 of the Commission's rules. These rules classify or presume certain services to be either commercial mobile radio services, or CMRS, or private mobile radio services, or PMRS, based on the frequency band used to provide service rather than on the characteristics of the service provided. That approach is premised on a paradigm developed more than 20 years ago when the Commission's rules contemplated distinct wireless services in each band. It is inconsistent, however, with the Commission's current flexible approach to licensing, which generally permits a licensee to provide any service it wishes subject to the technical rules and service for that band. This report and order will remove any presumptions about whether mobile services are regulated as commercial or private, and instead allow licensees to rely on the statutory definitions of those terms to identify the nature and regulatory treatment of their mobile services consistent with applicable service rules. Eliminating 20.7 and 20.9 will reduce disparate regulatory treatment of similar services in different frequency bands. It will allow licensees to offer a variety of services rapidly in response to consumer demands and competitive forces, and it will help bring beneficial services to businesses, state and local governments, and the public safety community while reducing the administrative burdens and processing delays that certain providers of these services currently face. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reed, for that compelling presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. What I'm about to say is reinforced if the cameras were to look at the rear of the room. If the topic of Part 20 of the Commission's rules were introduced at the average American dinner table, it might go over as well as a serving of Rocky Mountain oysters. Neither would be warmly received at my home.
Man, that's just wrong. I mean, even we have limits here, Commissioner.
Okay. The changes proposed in this order, coupled with the majority's dismantling of the open internet, you know it would end soon, have many unsavory implications for the future of competition policy. You're wondering how I was going to tie that in, right? As I made clear in my statement opposing the rollback of our open internet rules, I believe the proper interpretation of Section 332 of the Communications Act is that mobile broadband internet access service should be classified as a commercial mobile radio service, or CMRS, not a private mobile radio service. Eliminating our current Part 20 rules means we will remove precedent and procedures that could help parties demonstrate that a wireless company's mobile broadband service should be classified as CMRS. I understand that some may see this as a mere streamlining of commission rules, but in my opinion, this order removes important procedural safeguards, such as requiring the Commission to put certain applications out on public notice, which can help inform parties who are interested in challenging a company's claim that its mobile broadband internet access services should be classified as a private mobile radio service. And since that result is inconsistent with my view of proper classification for mobile broadband services, I respectfully dissent from the order and will admit my first example might have been a little edgy. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner Riley.
Thank the staff for the work. No statement.
Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. The United States leads the world in wireless. One of the reasons for this success is the FCC's decision to embrace a flexible use policy for spectrum. Instead of mandating that a particular
It's an emotional topic.
Choked up on this one. Instead of mandating that a particular spectrum band be used with a specific type of wireless technology or service, we generally leave that choice to the private sector, which has a much better sense of consumer demand. This approach has enabled wireless networks in the U.S. to evolve with technology and to do so much more quickly than if operators had to obtain government sign-off at each step of the way. Our leadership in 4G is just one example of how this policy has worked to benefit consumers.